Hello everyone. In this video we will describe and demonstrate a project we created for Build18, a student organization in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, in which fun and interesting projects are brought to life in a week-long hackathon. Our project implements Conway's Game of Life on a FPGA board. We'll start off by describing what Conway's Game of Life is first. Next, we'll describe what an FPGA is and how designing for one differs from writing software code for a processor. We'll then demonstrate our project and some of its features, and finish with a discussion of some of the interesting methods that we used in the design of this project.
Conway's Game of Life, or Game of Life, is a computer simulation which operates according to a set of very simple rules. The game consists of a grid of cells which may be either alive or dead. The game progresses with discrete generations in which cells alternate between being alive or dead from one generation to the next. A set of simple rules determines which cells are alive in the next generation based on which neighbors of each cell are alive in the current generation. The rules are simple. Pay attention to the cell with a red border as I explain the rules. Any live cell with fewer than 2 live neighbors dies. This simulates loneliness. Any live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors lives on to the next generation because it has friends. Any live cell with more than 3 live neighbors dies from overpopulation, and any dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes a live cell from reproduction. Our project was implemented on an FPGA, a field programmable gate array. Unlike a processor whose digital logic is unalterable, an FPGA's digital logic can be reconfigured in the field. Instead of using a series of instructions to specify its behavior like a processor, an FPGA's design is reconfigured to implement that specific behavior. This means that we can design the hardware for a circuit which performs any functionality that we desire. This is a much lower level form of implementing a project than software programming. We specify the design of the hardware using a language known as SystemVerilog. Writing this code sometimes seems to resemble software coding, but rather than describing a series of instructions to be executed on a processor, the code describes the hardware design itself. Our project was implemented on an Altera DE2 development board, which contains a Cyclone 4 FPGA chip.
So we have an interesting user interface for the Game of Life. As you can see on the left, we have the main grid, and on the top right here, we have the mini-map. So one of the features is I can edit the grid by creating squares or deleting squares. And I can enter this into the next generation of Game of Life by just pressing a single key, or I can let it run. I can also speed it up, and actually the max speed of this is about 50 million generations per second, which is much faster than the frame rate of this monitor. So that's why you'll see some weird effects happening right now. And this is a lot faster than most implementations in software of this Game of Life. Some other features are I can zoom in, and as you can see, the actual window of the zoom window is shown on the mini-map. Move this around. Can zoom in all the way to a 4x4 grid. And as you can see on the bottom right, there are some basically stats kept about this. So I can clear it, and I can actually randomize the grid as well. And then if I let it run, you can see the generation number and then the total number of alive, which is a hex value. Zoom into some spots. You can see some of the leftovers from the Game of Life that are just static structures.
Our implementation methodology for this project was actually rather unique and kind of interesting. Unlike many implementations you may have seen of the Game of Life, our implementation doesn't use any software at all. There's no CPU involved. So that means we have to somehow come up with another way to construct these values and figure out which cells are alive and dead. We also use a very interesting display technique. Most modern displays actually use something called a frame buffer, which is a bunch of memory that's set aside to hold a picture of what should be displayed on the screen. The CPU then creates that picture, a process we call rendering. It creates that picture into the memory, and then the monitor, as it needs to figure out which color a particular pixel is as it's displaying the image, just goes to that memory and reads the memory. That's called a frame buffer. In our system, we didn't use a frame buffer at all. We instead use a system where we calculate on the fly as each pixel needs to be generated. We calculate at that point in time what the value actually should be for display on the screen. So there's no memory, no frame buffer, and also no CPU involved. Instead, we have a system that starts out with the location on the screen, basically an XY coordinate of the pixel that is being displayed at this very instant. And then that value is fed into some digital logic circuitry that do the calculation to figure out what color that particular pixel needs to be. This is mostly combinational circuitry, involves a little bit of state set aside in some flip-flops, but almost all of it is a bunch of basic Boolean gates calculating that new value. And so given a coordinate on the screen, our circuitry then determines the color of that pixel and outputs it at exactly the right time when it should be displayed.
And for all of you SystemVerilog hardware nerds out there, I will now describe how we implemented this project in our code. Our design uses an interesting technique to construct the game of life grid. You may be familiar with the generate block statement in the SystemVerilog language, which allows you to use loops and control statements to control how much hardware is actually generated. Similar to how a function in software programming can invoke itself recursively until a base case is reached, we discovered that it's possible for a SystemVerilog module to recursively instantiate itself until a base case on the parameter is reached. This technique, as it turns out, can be elegantly applied to the design of Game of Life. The base case module calculates all of the rules of Game of Life for a single cell. In the recursive layer above the base case, 4 single cells are instantiated along with all of the connections among the cells to create a 2x2 grid. The next layer instantiates 4 sets of this 2x2 grid and so on for 6 layers, resulting in a 64 by 64 cell grid. In order to control the recursion depth, we used a SystemVerilog parameter on the recursive module, which represents the layer number.
And so that's our project, a fantastic implementation of Game of Life on an FPGA. We did it in a really interesting fashion using just digital logic, no CPUs, no frame buffers. We also took advantage of some cool SystemVerilog stuff, learned a bunch along the way. All in all, it was an absolutely fantastic week-long, spent many times late hours in the lab, but at the very end we came out with a product we're really proud of that works really well, that actually shows off a lot of the capabilities of the FPGA and the way to generate these circuits. So we had a great time. We're very happy to have had this opportunity to show it to you. Thanks very much. For more information on this and other wonderful Build18 projects, visit build18.org.